Welcome back to Face the Nation. Last year, Nikuyah Walker was just one Charlottesville resident infuriated by the local response to the protests on August 12th. So she went to the next city council meeting.
The change that needs to take place in this town is going to require people in power that can handle it.
She decided to run as an independent candidate for city council and ended up getting elected mayor. We spoke with her in Charlottesville earlier. Do you think this community a year later has healed, has changed?
Absolutely not.
Not at all?
No, because the issues were not the rally or just statues. The issue is this deep-seated racism that we have here, and that's the challenge. And that's a lot of work, and it takes commitment. And while people don't want alt-right, white men in khaki pants and polo shirts, walking through town, and they want to make it clear that they don't identify there. They have been very comfortable with racism and how it plagues the community.
So you think that the community still hasn't fixed some of the problems at the root of this kind of?
Oh, a year isn't long enough. We're talking about issues that have been going on here for centuries.
Do you think Charlottesville is representative of other cities in America?
I think if you start talking about the issues that we're facing around the country that relate to race and class, you can put Charlottesville up there as a city to study, and you'll find all the major disparities exist. And we hear these stories all across the country. We heard them in, Florida with Trayvon Martin and Ferguson, and with Tamir Rice and Cleveland. Like we hear these stories about people who are just shocked at where we are in our communities in regards to racism. But even once the facts are presented, people really don't want to change their actions to help truly heal that.
I think those images from last year shocked so many people because they think of Charlottesville as Thomas Jefferson's hometown, world-class university, world-class hospital, arts community, all of it. You ran on this platform, Unmask the Illusion.
Yes.
What's the illusion?
Because while it is Thomas Jefferson's hometown, you're talking about a president who enslaved people and built his empire off the backs of Black people. So that's the truth that we don't want to tell, right? You're talking about world-class university, but who is in that university? Who's able to walk those grounds versus who built the university? That university was built off of enslaved laborers.
One of the rallying points for the Unite the Right rally last year was around the Confederate statues, the monument to Robert E. Lee. He's still sitting right out there.
Yes.
The fact that that statue is still standing there has to be very frustrating for you.
What I often say to people is you have to have people who want to be on the right side of history. While, the law is the way that it is now, we have a judge at our circuit court. He's creative and working around whatever legal measures, are in place for us to take the statue down. It seems to be a lot of, support and research from his direction into making sure that it can stay up.
Because of the way that the state functions, unless my understanding is it's designated or determined to be a symbol of white supremacy, the war monument can't be taken down. Or
not a war memorial, yes. So that's the question, is whether it's a war memorial or not, right?
What does it represent to you?
The hate that it caused, the hate that it drew here, that people were able to mobilize behind a decision that the previous council had made about removing those statues and get that many people into this area to make sure that we understood that they were going to do everything within their power not to let that happen. That means that absolutely it must come down, right?
To you, it's a clear answer to the question, is it a sign of white supremacy? You're saying yes.
Yes, it definitely is. That statue went up in the 20s. The war had ended long before then.
But why pretend that that part of history, I guess, is the argument, didn't happen? Why not leave it and learn from it?
Yeah, no, it's not about pretending that it didn't happen. We look all over this nation and you have symbols of white supremacy up, right, all over the place, that you can look and it says that white is superior, right? It tells a story. People look around them and all they see is symbols, portraits of white faces. So that story of just white dominance overall is something that we have struggled with as a country.
In the year that has passed, have you seen anything bridged? Have you seen from the top down in this country or in this community? Any good come?
Yeah, there's been good. I mean, we have a community here who, not all the people in the community, but we have a good segment of the population who has come together to fight. Has taken on the call to make sure that justice and equity is a part of their everyday lives, and understand that they have to take that into every room they walk in.
We'll be right back with our discussion of race in America, 1 year after Charlottesville. For some perspective on the state of race relations in America, we brought a very special panel together today. DeRay McKesson is an activist with Black Lives Matter. He works with former Obama administration communicators at Crooked Media, and he's the author of On the Other Side of Freedom, The Case for Hope, which comes out next month. Christian Picciolini is a former white supremacist whose organization, the Free Radicals Project, now seeks to pull other people out of the life that he left behind. He's also the author of the book, White American Youth. John Meacham is a historian and author. His latest book is The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. And Jamelle Bouie is the chief political correspondent for Slate magazine, who has studied and written extensively about the history of slavery in America. He's also a political analyst here at CBS News, and perhaps most importantly, dad to a 10-year-old baby boy named Carter. So congratulations to you, 10-day-old. I should say. I want to start with you, Jamelle. I should also mention you're a Charlottesville resident. You heard a lot of frustration from the mayor. Yeah. When we look nationally, the latest CBS poll shows that racial tensions in the past year have increased. And the percentage of Americans saying that, 61%. The majority of this country thinks it's getting worse. Right. Why hasn't there been national healing?
I think the principal reason why there hasn't been national healing is simply that the president seems to see a political advantage in sort of intensifying racial strife and racial conflict. I think
You put this solely on him?
I think I don't know how I'd completely distribute the blame, but I think it really does matter that the president, far from trying to find avenues for racial understanding or healing, instead goes after black football players, instead makes a show of getting into spats and fights with black celebrities, instead still has not been able to bring himself to fully condemn white supremacists. Even his statement yesterday, we condemn racism against all sides, is sort of nonsensical. What happened in Charlottesville last year wasn't racism against all sides. It was white supremacists going after black communities, going after other communities of color. So I don't know, it's impossible to kind of break out some numerical distribution again for how much blame goes to whom. But I think if the president is supposed to be this national voice of unity, it really does matter that the president has explicitly rejected that calling, instead fanning the flames of, I think, racial strife.
John, you've written this book, The Soul of America. You were inspired in many ways by what happened in Charlottesville, and you've said that this is a moment almost like what we saw in the hours after the Civil War.
Absolutely. I think this moment's not new. I think it's the most vivid manifestation in memory of some of the worst instincts in the American character.
So it's not a Trump effect per se?
No, he's exacerbated it, and he's both marshaled fear and manufactured it. I think the reason he's at the pinnacle of power, for many reasons. We have a white supremacist march or rally in Washington today. In 1925, there were 50,000 Klansmen coming down Pennsylvania Avenue. H.L. Mencken covered it. 1926, same thing happened. There were 3 to 5 million members of the Klan in the 20s. The institutions of the Republic worked in order to fight that. Just because it's happened before, though, doesn't mean we relax. What it does mean, I think, is that we look at these moments where the perennial American problem around the issues of race, which has been going on for about 400 years, from when we were British North America to when we were under the Articles of Confederation to, and you've got to love a Sunday when you can mention the Articles of Confederation, just as a basic rule, to the Constitution, all the way through the Civil War and forward. It is the perennial issue in the life of the nation. And so while we shouldn't think that tomorrow can be absolutely, is all going to disappear, tomorrow can be better. There is a lesson within the last 50 years that with the civil rights legislation in the 1960s, things got better. So to surrender to the fear as opposed to embracing the hope, to go to your point, is a real setback in terms of presidential leadership.
Deray, you've in some ways made a career out of trying to make better tomorrows, to borrow John's phrase there, as a protester. But you began doing this as an activist well before there was a President Trump. Why do you think Black Lives Matter needs to be out there on the streets today counter-protesting instead of ignoring Unite the Right?
Yeah, I think it's important that we always stand up and tell the truth. I've always thought about protest as the idea of telling the truth in public, and that's important. There will be many people out. When you ask the question, too, about sort of what healing looks like, it's like I'm mindful that truth comes before the reconciliation, right? And what we find in this moment is people unwilling to tell the truth about where we are. So what does it mean that we're in a country where a third of all the people killed by a stranger is actually killed by a police officer? 1 in 11 homicides in California is committed by an officer. We talk about some of the disparities. It's like in New York City, 90% of the people arrested for marijuana are Black and brown. You don't believe that 90% of the people who use marijuana in New York City are Black or brown, and we arrest more people for weed than all violent crimes combined. Like, those things are about race. And until we are actually able to walk into that and say, like, this is actually happening and that we should do something structurally to change it, I think there will always be here. Is that Trump sort of sticks us in this moment where it's a lot of emotion and a lot of rhetoric, but no real substance. Even the prison bill that he's putting forth could all be done administratively. Like, that actually doesn't need Congress to do it, but like, he traps us in this conversation that isn't moving us anywhere. So I'm interested in how do we continue to tell the truth, whether it's on the street or whether it's in spaces like this or boardrooms, that actually sets us up to change structures.
You're talking about the prison reform and possibly sentencing reform that could address mandatory minimums.
Yeah, so sentencing reform has not been a part of any iteration of the bill that we've seen so far, the first act bill, or first step. But all the things that they're proposing, like not shackling pregnant women, they could do that now. Sessions is against those things. But again, like, this is about saying this is what's happening in this country, and like, we can actually do something structural to address it. And people talk about truth and reconciliation without acknowledging that the truth comes first.
I want to ask you here, because there's a criticism about having conversations like this, which is that somehow we are stoking racial division by talking about it rather than healing. You had made the point you need to talk about things. You were recruited into a white supremacist movement when you were 14, is that right?
That's correct, yeah, 1987.
Is talking about this how it works?
You know, I think we have to talk about it because there are two things that extremists love. They love silence and they love violence. If we're silent, they grow because they're unfettered. They can convince people. If we're violent, we play right into their hands because they come to places like Washington, D.C. or Charlottesville or even Skokie, Illinois in the 1970s because they're progressive communities and their whole job is to provoke and to intimidate. So, you know, I think we cannot be silent about it, but we also can't adopt their tactics and be violent.
So for these counter-protesters today, your advice would be keep your
visible,
distance.
be vocal, be vigilant, but don't be violent.
Do you agree with some of the journalism around what you've seen with the Unite the Right rally, that actually things have gotten harder in the past year, that they're more splintered, that there has been a negative impact on that movement?
I've seen it myself. Several of the leaders and the organizers from last year have publicly stated not to go to the rally, but I think that it's a PR move for them. I think that they're trying to mainstream even further because they know that their image from last year didn't sit well even with, you know, American white racists in some cases. So now they're even going further into the mainstream and they're starting to drop even some of that oppressive language.
And I think on that point, there's good evidence that some of this mainstream movement has been successful. The Senate candidate in Virginia, Corey Stewart, essentially openly allies himself with these figures, has it's been seen in photos with known white supremacists, has white nationalists on his campaign staff, people who have worked with them. And that's serious. He's a United States Senate candidate.
Who was endorsed by the President of the United States.
Exactly. That for me is evidence that even if there was a major setback in Charlottesville last year, that the larger conflict here is far from settled, and that white supremacists and white nationalists, or however you want to call them, are making their way into mainstream politics and pushing arguments that are finding their place in mainstream conversations.
Don't forget that David Duke was a Louisiana House of Representatives for 3 years.
Right.
And said last year that we got to take our country back. This is why we elected Donald Trump. He said that in Charlottesville. And this is a political strategy that's been unfolding since January 1866, when a guy named Edward Alfred Pollard, a Richmond journalist, wrote a book called The Lost Cause, where he argued that the war was over, but the battle for ideas, the argument against what was called consolidated government then, but big government, the fight against Washington, that this would be the war by other means. And it was the entire intellectual and cultural architecture of the resistance to the implications of the verdict of the Civil War. And it's been unfolding not simply in the South, but with the complicity of the North for 150 years.
I want to talk more about this on the other side of the commercial break, so stay with us, and we hope all of you will be back with us in a moment. And we're back now with our panel. John Meacham, I want to begin with you here. The Republican National Committee this morning is using their platform to discredit a senior African-American aide to President Trump who was fired, who now says that she has actually heard him use racial slurs. Why is the Republican Party addressing this?
Because it's now a wholly owned subsidiary of the Trump organization, and has been since he was clearly going to be the nominee. The Republican,
does it suggest there's been a political cost
for the Republicans and Trump? I mean, well, there's not right now. The political cost is fairly de minimis because they're in power. Basically, broadly put, the Republican Party and the conservative movement in the United States, which are not always the same things, basically sold their soul to Donald Trump in exchange for lower tax rates and Supreme Court justices. I don't think it's a hell of a lot more complicated than that. And so now, having done that, they have to defend the often indefensible. And you have otherwise serious people who will say the craziest things in defense of Donald Trump that they would never have imagined saying before.
And yet
because this is why this was the cost of power.
Senator Tim Scott on this program was not fully defending the president, but saying he has found ways to work with him, that it's not. That's
the code, right? Yeah, that's what they're saying to get through the day. I think they're going to have an extraordinarily difficult time in the midterm and long term, not midterm elections, but the middle term and long term, because they know this isn't what they want to be. Right. I mean, this is the party of. And whether you agree or disagree with them, the party of Eisenhower and George Herbert Walker Bush and Ronald Reagan and John McCain and Mitt Romney and whatever you want to say about those folks, those were characters of the first rank, I believe, but in a public sense. And now you have this remarkable takeover, and as I've sometimes joked, it's the first recorded case of a hijacker boarding a plane and the passenger side with the hijacker.
It is too, like the rhetoric doesn't match the reality. So Trump can say whatever he wants, but we know this administration is calling for the death penalty or asking for the death penalty for drug dealers. That is wild. That Nikuyah in our team, this administration has said that the war on poverty is over, that there are only about 200,000 people in poverty.
She's disputed some of that reporting, but
you're like, this is wild. So we see his record on race, and we've obviously seen the kids in cages. That it doesn't match the rhetoric that we see him now employing that suggests that he has moved at all.
I want to ask you about that rhetoric because it's racially tinged. It's not always quite so clear. People can dispute what the president actually meant. When he tweeted this week about the NFL players and their protest, what did you hear?
He has only attacked black athletes. He has a history of attacking black people who criticize him. He didn't say anything about Eminem, who made like a whole screed against him, but he's come out against so many other people. And when we think about the NFL, it's like Colin was not protesting the flag. He was saying that Colin Kaepernick was not protesting the flag. He was saying that the country has a racist history and that so much of that racist history bleeds over to the present. That is just true, is that the police are killing people. You've seen it, I've seen it. That's what Colin was saying, and that's what the other players were saying. So you see Trump trying to silence that. I do think what Trump does that is sort of interesting is that he is like dismantling the FBI, and people are seemingly okay with that. If I said those things about the FBI, like they would be at my house again. They already visited my house once, but he says it and it's just like a normal, you're like, okay. And it's like, no, that's why he even just came out and criticized Sessions again, which I missed a day ago.
I think there's something about sort of how to interpret those statements. It's worth looking at sort of how other Republicans interpret those statements and how his statements can make their way into electoral politics. And so I'm going to focus on Virginia again because I'm a Virginian and that's just what I do. In last year's gubernatorial election, the Republican candidate Ed Gillespie, towards the end, started running mailers, attacking kneeling football players, started talking about Confederate statues, started sort of using Trump language and doing so in a way that was clearly meant to energize kind of like white anxiety, white resentment.
The argument there, though, is that it's actually about patriotism, that it's not racial. You dispute that fully.
This is all
and
coded.
Christian agrees with you.
I mean, it's to echo DeRay, when you're only attacking black football players, when sort of this language is also tied up in language like Blue Lives Matter and so on and so forth, it's really difficult to say that this is about patriotism, especially when the players themselves are saying repeatedly, no, this is about police brutality. And when you add that in to the sort of slippery conflation of, say, criminal gangs like MS-13 and like immigrants broadly, when you add that into the defense of Confederate statues, it begins to strain credulity to say, oh no, this is not about the clear racial stuff, it's about everything else.
Yeah, I mean, these are not dog whistles. We've all heard this phrase. This is a bullhorn for somebody like me who 30 years ago would say the same things. What he's doing is he's creating the conditions that make people afraid, and then he's using fear and manipulation to continue that cycle. Calling out thugs as, the football players, like he said, or just African Americans in general. This is all coded language that's been polished and made more palatable, because he knows it speaks to people about issues that they have a hard time arguing, like freedom of speech.
Here. Christian, thank you. We'll be right back in a moment. We just have to take this break. I want to thank the panel for joining us for today's discussion and for our viewers. Thank you for watching. It's an important conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.